Hello, everyone, and welcome in. Today, we're going to be jumping into the crafting guide for Duelyst 2. These are going to be all of the most important cards to get right away. These are commons and rares. They're very easy to get, very cheap to get. A lot of these you already have one or two copies of from the starter deck as well. So it's just about filling out those numbers, building a strong foundation, and making sure you have good quality cards to, begin your collection. I'm going to be starting with neutral cards. These are going to be able to be splashed into any faction, of course, and it just means that, especially when you're first starting out, you have the ability to kind of build a decent deck for any faction for the purposes of daily quests and stuff like that. So, yeah, let's just jump right in. Blood Tier Alchemist is on the list here. I'm just going to go by mana cost. But Blood Tier Alchemist is a really solid card just in terms of utility. I mean, a 2-mana 2/1 is decent, but the ability is what really matters. The 1 damage allows you to fix trades. A lot of other 2-drops in the game are around a 2/3 stat line, so Blood Tier Alchemist plus a general attack, or Blood Tier Alchemist plus hitting it with your own 2/3 allow you to clear a unit, fight for some tempo. Clearing out other 1 HP units can be very helpful, and also giving you a little bit of counterplay against like artifacts and ranged units as well. Like 2 copies of this is usually what I like to squeeze into decks that need to have a wider variety of answers, and I think it's just a great card overall. Note as well, you can deal 1 damage to any unit. It doesn't have to be an enemy unit, so sometimes pinging your own thing can open up a spot for better positioning, so don't be afraid to get creative with this. Moving on, we've got the classic Healing Mystic. This card is just solid all around. 2-mana 2/3. Healing a unit for 2 means that you can just top off your own general in the early mid game. If your general or another one of your 2/3s strike into a unit, you can just top it back off, get more tempo that way. Don't be afraid to play this out in the early game, especially as your turn 1 play. Even if you lose out on the healing, getting the 2/3 into play is much more important. And of course, this is just a fantastic card for filling out your deck when it needs a little bit more early game. The healing is always nice because Duelyst is, by its very nature, a very aggressive game. So you're going to find use for the healing no matter what. Primus Fist is next up. It's very similar to Healing Mystic in the way that it lets you fix trades. It lets you really double down on an early mid-game advantage. The buff is permanent, so you can just set up a couple units and then Primus Fist to make it even harder for your opponent to clear your board favorably. And this is just, again, a solid foundational card in the neutral pool, and it's a slightly higher priority craft for aggressive builds. This wasn't initially on my early crafting guide, but because it's a common, I do want to give a quick shout out to / honorable mention for Rust Crawler, just dealing with artifacts. I think that solid aggressive play and Blood Tier Alchemist kind of does the job, but I'm a bit of a hater, so I don't mind running like 1 or 2 copies of Rust Crawler if my deck has the room for it, because you're able to catch up a lot of decks with that card. Saberspine Tiger, I definitely want to give a shout out to. You can think of this card basically like a neutral removal spell. It offers a little bit of reach and burst damage as well for, just budgety mid-range decks where you can deal an extra 3 or 4 or 5 damage to close out games. It's really important. And also deal with pesky backline threats that your deck might not be able to, like decks that are kind of low on removal or factions that are kind of low on removal. Stuff like Vitruvian especially might need to have the Saberspine Tiger just as a way to clear some of those units. So I love the utility on this card, and it's a common. This is a fantastic hiccup for early aggressive builds, and it's going to give you a lot of mileage for sure. Repulsor Beast normally would be on this list, but you actually get a copy of it for free. So make sure you keep an eye on Repulsor Beast as well as, a inverse Saberspine Tiger where you can still remove something by just throwing it into a corner. You don't have to worry about it anymore. But speaking of aggression, I accidentally skipped over Flameblood Warlock. Flameblood Warlock is another great early drop. This is a higher priority for aggressive builds, but again, a 2-mana 3/1 threatens to deal a lot of damage to the enemy general, or it just trades up into whatever their early play might be. It not only is a great opener, but then it forces your opponent to play defensively around it. So if you're living that aggro life, then Flameblood Warlock is a great early pickup for your decks. Another card that I have to give a special shout out to is Ephemeral Shroud. We don't see a lot of this card in the current metagame. A lot of decks right now are just kind of based on raw stats. There's not a lot of huge synergies and really devastating effects that need to be answered or can't be answered by just using hard removal on it. But Ephemeral Shroud, as time goes on, will become better and better and more ubiquitous. And this is a higher priority craft for Abyssian, who does not have access to Dispel normally. If you want to play something in Abyssian that's a little bit slower, then Ephemeral Shroud is going to be a card for you to look at. Wings of Paradise is a great 3-drop that I want to shout out. I think that 3 mana units in Duelyst 2 are a little bit of a premium right now. There's not too many super good ones, and Wings of Paradise being a 3 mana 3/3 with flying means that you can place this damage pretty much wherever you need to, and it's just a delayed Saberspine Tiger, right? It's pretty resilient, forces your opponent to take a turn to answer this, rather than potentially developing more threats, which is great to buy you some time. In an aggressive deck, this does threaten to deal just 5 damage directly to the opponent that they also can't avoid. So if you feel like you need more 3 mana units, this is a great early pickup and fills out a deck nicely for the 3 mana slot and just like on a budget because it is only a rare. I think that this card should definitely be way more popular, so I'm doing a little bit of propaganda here. Next up is the end-all be-all of mid-range decks and even control decks. It's just a good card in general. It's Emerald Rejuvenator. A 4 mana 4/4 is such a solid body. 4 HP is a really important breakpoint in Duelyst because not a ton of removal just answers this 1-for-1 efficiently. You have to play something that's a little bit more expensive, right? Or your opponent has to use a spell in tandem with hitting with their general or a unit. So while stabilizing your general for 4 HP, this is also going to do a lot of work on board on its own. Playing 2 of these on turn 8 is a fantastic play. Healing for 8 and setting up 2 4/4s is nuts. This is just a 3 of auto include most of the time. And even in decks that normally wouldn't like healing, sometimes you just need a good 4 mana unit to play. And speaking of good 4 mana units, I want to also say that Hailstone Golem is absolutely bonkers. I think that even as a vanilla 4 mana 4/6 is just so strong for pressuring the opponent. It trades so well into every early mid-game unit, especially when you're going second. You can just slam this thing down. Or even if you're going first, right? You just ramp and play this on turn 2. Your opponent has to have very specific removals to deal with this efficiently. And if they don't, you kind of generate a lot of tempo by forcing them to take a more defensive turn that early on and continue to snowball a lead. You get a couple of these right out of the box, so make sure you complete your set and just throw this in to fill out any budget deck or any generic deck, especially again when you're building out your collection early. Moving on to the 5-drops, we have the All-Star, the King, the Ubiquitous, Dancing Blades. 5 mana 4/6. Again, great stat line, just like the Hailstone Golem, but it also deals 3 damage to the minion in front of this. So you have to pay attention to your positioning with this card, but if your opponent doesn't respect it, doesn't play around it, you essentially get to summon a giant unit and then remove a unit from the board in the same turn. It's incredibly devastating. There's a lot of times where your opponent will play around this too much. It basically forces them to play their unit very defensively, and if they don't, they get blown out of the water. It's a great way, especially at that specific mana point on 5 mana that's only a couple turns into the game. You just take control and start to snowball your lead and barrel towards almost a free win. I love this card. Absolutely should be a 3 of in a lot of your budget decks, and it's going to be very, very common for the foreseeable future. This card, Zenrui the Blightspawn, it is a legendary So this isn't the sort of card that you want to craft right away. But I felt that because this card is just so strong, I should definitely simply mention it here for anybody who wants a good neutral card. Again, the theme being that this is such a generically good effect that you can put it in almost any deck. So if you happen to open a copy of Zenrui, don't be afraid to just slot it in as a one of into whatever you happen to be building. This is similar to Dancing Blades in its ability to just swing the board back in your favor. It's really disgusting. And, notable targets, things like Obelisks and Vitruvian. You can steal Lantern Fox from Songhai, even Magmar's Young Silithar. Very, very strong targets to take with this. There's a little bit of extra Vitruvian synergy with Zenrui because of their spell Blind Scorch that sets a unit's attack to 0, and then you can take it over with Zenrui no matter how big it is. And finally, for the neutrals, we have the Archon Spellbinder. This is just the godfather of beat sticks in this game. 6 mana, 7/9. The stats are absolutely ridiculous. And it has a passive. Your opponent's spells cost 1 more to play. So if you are even or ahead, just slamming the Archon Spellbinder forces your opponent to take pretty much their entire turn to deal with this. There's very few spells that answer this efficiently. Off the top of my head, I can only think of something like Martyrdom or Hailstone Prison or maybe Demonic Lure to throw it into a corner. But in the case of the Demonic Lure, you still get the spell increase passive as this thing remains alive. So overall, it's still a fantastic card, a fantastic play, and it's a 3 of in any super late game focused deck. If you're thinking about building control, anything focused on the late game, Archon Spellbinder is going to be in that deck, at least 2 copies of it. And notably, this effect does stack. If you're able to summon 2 Archon Spellbinders, then your opponent's spells cost 2 more to play. And from there, it's just impossible for them to clear this tanky HP efficiently, and they'll just lose. Because the threat of taking 7 damage means that if they don't remove it, your opponent has to start running away and playing units in front of the Archon Spellbinder to block it, and it's just going to eat your opponent's resources for free. And so there are some other really good neutral cards, but again, these are just the highest priority cards that give you the most bang for your buck when you're first starting your collection off, and specifically neutral cards that are good pretty much in any faction. And now to move on to the individual factions. Again, a lot of the cards that are recommended here, some of these you'll already have 1 or 2 copies from the starter decks that you get for the factions. And I'm mentioning them here just so you can finish rounding out those numbers and to call attention to the specific cards that are incredibly good, in my opinion. Lasting Judgment, get 3 copies of this and don't look back. It's such a fantastic early mid-game cheap tempo removal, right? 2 mana to deal 3 to a unit is so strong for throwing your opponent off, fixing trades, and then later in the game, especially on a bigger unit like a Dancing Blades or a Hailstone Golem or any of the big Lionar units, it just becomes a great buff to burst your opponent down. Next up, Holy Immolation. This is an epic rarity card, so it's not a budget card per se, but this card is just so obscenely powerful. It's a 3 of auto-include staple card for Lionar. Regardless of what strategy or archetype you're playing, 3 Holy Immolation is just the way to go. It wipes your opponent's board a lot of the time. It's basically main decking up to 12 direct damage to your opponent's face. And it's just the presence of this card forces your opponent to play very specifically around it. And the classic combination of summoning a 2 mana unit and then immediately using Holy Immolation on it on 6 mana is what Lionar always is trying to set up to do to you at that point in the game. So if you are playing Lionar seriously, if you want to be a Lionar main, if you're really vibing with them, get 3 Holy Immolation immediately. If you're on a bit more of a budget, 1 or 2 copies will suffice, but you'll feel the power of this card immediately as soon as you get it. Another card that is ubiquitous to Lionar strategies is Ironcliff Guardian. I think that this is just a great curve topper for a lot of mid-range lists. The Divine Bond strategies of a spell that buffs a unit based on how much HP it has synergizes perfectly with Ironcliff Guardian's stats. Every faction lives in fear, right? You have to mulligan and hang on to a removal spell to deal with Ironcliff Guardian, because you'll be amazed at how many games this card will just win you, because you slam it down expecting your opponent to remove it, but then they don't have the removal, just so happens they don't have it, and then you either lock them down for several turns, because 10 HP is a lot to chew through in Duelyst, or you have the Divine Bond follow-up, and you hit your opponent for 13, and they just can't come back from it. I should definitely mention there is a bit of a budget min-max here, where you can replace Ironcliff Guardian with Bright Moss Golem, which you should already have, right? You just get these for free in the starter deck. It's still a 5-mana 4/9, so you're still getting the same amount of attack from Divine Bond, but because Bright Moss Golem has 4 attack, it doesn't die to Night Sorrow Assassin and Abyssian, so that could be a consideration. However, with Ironcliff Guardian, because it is airdrop and provoke, the upside of being able to lock down your opponent from anywhere might supersede the Bright Moss inclusion. A bit of a stretch goal for Lionar, I want to point out, is Arclight Regalia. This is, again, not a immediate craft, but more of a stretch goal, in my opinion. Especially if you're playing something more late game focused for Lionar, Arclight Regalia just threatens the most long-term value of any card in the game. If your opponent is, again, artifacts are so strong when you are already ahead on board or even, and if you can set up Arclight Regalia and just start wailing on your opponent, start clearing their units really efficiently, the resulting tempo is just too much for your opponent to handle. Generally, you can get away with only 2 copies of Arclight Regalia. There have been some very greedy modern Lionar lists right now that are running 3 copies, because the damage reduction does stack. So if you have 2 of these equipped, the first instance of damage will be reduced by 4, and so on. So you can just make yourself nigh invincible depending on what your opponent's deck build actually is. Moving on to Songhai, I've got to mention the Inner Focus, right? 0-mana spell, activate an allied minion with 3 or less attack. When you summon a unit in Duelyst, normally it can't move until the next turn. That Inner Focus lets you get around that. Any unit with 3 or less attack, and you can use multiple of these on the same unit as long as it can survive whatever it's striking against. So the amount of damage that this threatens is just absolutely enormous. On average, it's about 3. So if you think of Inner Focus as 0 mana, deal 3 damage, you begin to understand how strong this really is. There are some builds that maybe like to hold on to this as a combo piece, combining it with Scarlet Viper or, Gorehorn. But at the end of the day, you can just use this as 0 mana, deal 3 in a very aggressive Songhai deck, just to make sure that you're drawing 2 cards at the end of your turn and you're seeing more and more of your deck. Next up, Tusk Boar. This is a legendary card, so it feels like it shouldn't be recommended here in a crafting guide, a pseudo budget guide. But this card is just so obscenely broken that if you plan on playing Songhai, this card alone will increase the power level of your deck tenfold. Like, just having 1 or 2 copies even just gives you an extra 3, 6, or 9 damage every single game. The opening play of Tusk Boar, when you're going first, being able to take that center mana tile and maybe set up another 1-drop, or simply zone out your opponent, deny that ramp, is absolutely huge. And the threat of it returning to your action bar means that if you hit your opponent with it, they're going to have to take another 3 damage just to remove it from the board, so you don't get to use it again. It's just a disgusting card. If you're going to play Songhai, just get your 3 copies, abuse this card, and then just disenchant it once it eventually gets nerfed. Like, it's that strong that I have to recommend it even as a legendary. Lantern Fox is a very, very strong card when you're combining it with spell-based synergies. It can feel clunky in unit-based strategies because you aren't churning through your hand as quickly, in my experience, but it can still be strong as like a 1-of in those decks just to get some extra value. But overall, The best Songhai deck is the aggro spell one, so Lantern Fox just by necessity makes itself a high priority. Killing Edge also incredibly high priority. It's great in spell-based lists. It's great in unit-based lists. 3 mana plus 4 attack plus 2 HP is nuts. Even if you don't get the bonus draw from casting out on the backstab unit, just putting it on a Tuskboar or a Saber Spine Tiger or even a Heartseeker is just obscene, the damage that this threatens. And of course, we get to the Four Winds Magus, the backbone of the spell-based strategies. You play this down, and then whenever you cast a spell, not only do you damage the enemy general, you heal your general. So it means that your opponent can't race you down, right? It's hard to really fathom the amount of damage and healing that this can threaten to the opponent. And it means that they have to take their turn responding to this. And if you're already ahead and you slam the Four Winds Magus, play a couple spells in the same turn in a combo so you get some immediate value out of it. When your opponent does remove it, it's not as bad because you've already gotten some value from it. And because they take a turn off to respond to your threat, it means that you get to maintain your tempo and establish more threat on your next turn. I do want to give a shout out here to Onyx Bear Seal. Again, is a bit of a stretch goal, right? 3 mana, epic rarity, and you're already starting to notice the theme in Songhai, right? It's probably one of the, I don't want to even say probably, it's one of the strongest, if not the strongest faction in the game in terms of just raw power level and damage output, but the cards are really expensive. So Onyx Bear Seal is a bit more of a stretch goal. This becomes, Songhai's premium removal card down the road, but for now, especially on a budget, Repulsor Beast is a nice replacement. But generally speaking, especially if you're a Songhai main, don't be afraid to pick up Onyx Bear Seal early. It's a great way to answer things like Ironcliff Guardian, or just things with a lot of HP, right, that Songhai normally wouldn't be able to respond to. Moving on to Vitruvian, we've got Dunecaster. This is basically the glue that ties all of your Dervish synergies together. And in the current Vitruvian card pool, regardless of the style of deck that you're building, you're going to run some Dervish synergy, right? Just because the cards are just generically good and you need to fill out the numbers for your deck, Dunecaster is going to find its way into the deck. And 2 mana to give +2/+2 is really, really strong for getting good trades and threatening a lot of face damage, a lot of burst damage. So, and this is only a common, so definitely pick this up. Bone Swarm is another card that Vitruvian really highly values. Direct face damage, and also an AoE, basically. A lot of units in Duelyst are clumped up a lot of the time around the general. That's going to be your main summoning point. So Bone Swarm does get a lot of value there, either to just clear small units or to set up trades for the rest of your board. And, late game, it's still that 2 or 4 damage that Bone Swarm will grant you can spell the difference between victory and defeat. Similar to Bone Swarm is Rasha's Curse. We get a little bit of artifact removal here, which is always nice, especially when you're on a budget. But then you summon a Wind Dervish. So the 2 damage can just hit the enemy general directly. You can use it to reach something in the back line. This Dervish combines with Dunecaster, so you're threatening potentially 4 damage onto something. Rasha's Curse is just a great pickup card. Even if you don't destroy an artifact, just getting a basically 2 mana deal 2 or more damage to something is fantastic, especially the way the Wind Dervishes combined with the Fireblaze Obelisk, just the passive of giving your dervishes +1. It's always great to play this proactively when you already have a few dervishes summoned, similar to Primus Fist. But if you set up the Fireblaze Obelisk and your opponent can't remove it immediately, suddenly you're threatening 3 damage either onto your opponent's general or to just clear a unit. The value that this threatens is great, and 3 mana is pretty cheap, right? You can just play this really early in the game. Your opponent has to have super specific removals to deal with the Fireblaze Obelisk, so pick that up right away. Entropic Decay, I want to mention here, it's, Vitruvian's only direct removal spell. It is a little bit limited because the minion has to be touching your general, so it's not great for moving backline threats, but still a good card regardless. And you just want to pick up that third copy and let it rock. Another card I want to give a shout out to is Windstrike. Similar to, again, the Wings of Paradise, where you have that threat of flying damage that you can assign anywhere. And then when this goes down, even if, you know what I mean, your opponent has to respond to this threat. And once it does, you still get the Staff of Akir, so that your general can also begin getting that big damage and those value trades. So moving on to Abyssian, Night Sorrow Assassin is one of their best cards, in my opinion. Destroying a nearby minion with 3 or less attack hits so many things in the early mid game. Even some late game cards, right, don't have enough attack to withstand Night Sorrow Assassin. Think Ironcliff Guardian, even things like Pandora. It's really hilarious. But it's a great way to generate tempo, answer backline threats. The 3/1 stat line also means that it threatens great damage and trading capacity even after you get this strong ability. Don't be afraid to play this in the early game just to generate some tempo and keep your opponent under control. If you keep your opponent's board empty, then they have less means to trade into your Wraithlings. You can build up your swarm quite nicely. Ritual Banishing as well. This is just a great removal spell where you get to destroy an allied minion and then destroy an enemy minion. And you're going to have a lot of tokens running around in swarmy Wraithling lists. And you can just use this as a 2-card combo, you know, play a 2-drop and then Ritual Banishing that 2-drop to answer your opponent's really big threat that you can't deal with otherwise. Sometimes you can activate your own Dying Wish synergies with this. I do really like this card, and it's only going to get better as time goes on because there's going to be bigger threats that you have to answer, and also there will be better ways for Abyssian to generate a lot of tokens to sacrifice, and there will be units with much better Dying Wishes to make use of this effect. I also want to give a shout out to Spectral Blade here. This is, in my opinion, one of the strongest artifacts in the entire game. For 2 mana, your general gets +2 attack, so you immediately are able to answer anything that's, you know, played in the early mid game for the most part. And because when you destroy a minion, you heal your general for 2, you're offsetting a lot of the damage, right? You get to take more aggressive trades, offset that damage, and just use this for raw tempo. The Spectral Blade also, because of the way you threaten the damage and trading potential, forces your opponent to play their units very defensively, so you buy a lot of time just by having this threat. I really like this card, and it's, in my opinion, at least 2 copies in most any Abyssian deck, and a lot of lists are running 3 just because the early healing and the potential for it to convert to a late game just like burst card, you know, you can just stack 2 of these, hit something for 6, is also great because the healing stacks as well. Make sure you pick up your 3rd copy of Void Pulse, great cheap card to make sure you're drawing 2 cards per turn, turning through your deck, do a little bit of direct face damage, helps close out games, helps set up your opponent for burst lethals, answers artifacts, and then heals your general as well. 1 mana heal 3 is incredibly good, and it allows you to play a much more tempo-oriented game plan in the early game because, you know, with Void Pulse, Emerald Rejuvenator, Healing Mystic, Spectral Blade all working together, that you're just going to heal off a lot of that early damage. Blood Moon Priestess is an epic rarity card, so it's not a super high priority craft, but you absolutely need this card if you plan on playing Swarm Abyssian in any capacity. Abyssian is, you know, at their core meant to be a bit of a swarmier faction. They want to get a bunch of Wraithling tokens in play, just a wide board in general, and then cash it in for, you know, big payoffs. And Blood Moon Priestess is the way to generate a lot of tokens, but also give your board resiliency. If your opponent casts AoE and they kill all your Wraithlings, Blood Moon Priestess will just replace them all. And don't forget that Death Watch also counts enemy units dying too, so you can play Blood Moon Priestess and then make a bunch of trades, get a bunch of Wraithlings down, and this is a card that just forces your opponent to deal with it. So make sure that when you play Blood Moon Priestess, you're able to make some trades and get some value in Wraithlings out of it immediately, because your opponent is going to remove this right away. Same with Shadow Dancer. This card, if it sticks to the board, it just kind of wins the game on its own because Duelyst is such a aggressive game. There's a lot of units being summoned and trading into one another. Things are going to be, dying left and right. And then every time a unit dies, especially when two units die, if your unit and your opponent's unit clash into one another and they both die, then you're going to heal for 2 and then deal 2 to your opponent. It just means that your opponent cannot race this down, essentially. It's like Four Winds Magus, where they have to take a turn off and answer the Shadow Dancer, because if they don't, it just adds so much inevitability to your decks. I have to also give a shout out here to Soul Shatter Pact. When I talk about cashing in your swarms, this is the card that's going to let you do that, right? 2 mana for an AoE +2 attack. Although it is not permanent, it doesn't need to be, because you're going to use Soul Shatter Pact to basically finish the game. Because this is so cheap, it's great to stack 2 of these, and even with only 2 or 3 Wraithlings in play, you're threatening so much damage onto the opponent's general. And it's only a common card, so you can craft 3 of these immediately, and you can start getting your swarmy payoff. It's a lot more consistent and, easier to get than the similar payoff cards of Deathfire Crescendo and Soul Grimoire. Other cards I have to mention as well in Abyssian is Spectral Revenant. This is similar to other staple expensive cards, Tuskboar, Mechantor Warbeast, Holy Immolation. Then Abyssian has Spectral Revenant. Just this giant late game unit comes down. Because it has Rush, it can act immediately, so either it removes a big threat or just deals 6 damage to the opponent directly, and it's either going to deal 6 damage or use its effect to deal 4 damage. Notably, this procs not only when it attacks or when it destroys a unit, but just when it damages an enemy minion. So that means if your opponent has to trade back into this, they're going to take 8, 12. This is a very scary boy to deal with. So if you are an Abyssian main, this is, one of your stretch goals that you want to pick up, especially for late game focused Abyssian decks. And if I want to talk about Abyssian's late game, I've got to talk about Shadow Nova, right? Once we get to 7 mana, we're threatening a similar amount of damage with the Shadow Nova, and this also functions as an AoE. I would go so far as to say that in the current metagame, Shadow Nova is a little bit better than Spectral Revenant, because you can clear multiple units if your opponent isn't playing around this card. This is a lot cheaper to get because it's a rare. The Shadow Novas they scale ridiculously. The Shadow Creep tiles deal damage equal to the amount of Shadow Creep that's in play. So without any creep tiles set up, Shadow Nova is dealing 4 damage in a 2x2 square on the grid. And a lot of Abyssian decks these days will just run Abyssal Crawler as a one-of. You get the Shadow Creep tile. You get 1 or 2 of these on average throughout the course of the game, and then your Shadow Nova is dealing 6 damage in an AoE. So you're hitting your opponent for 6 damage, just like Spectral Revenant, and then you're also clearing their board. A lot of very few units have more than 6 HP, and then you've completely broken your opponent's pressure against you, and then they're at the mercy of you maybe playing a second Shadow Nova, threatening to deal 10 more direct damage to their face and just ending the game. Moving on to Magmar, I think Primordial Gazer is a fantastic pickup. It's a common card. A 3 mana 4/2 is an aggressively weighted stat line. It's guaranteed to trade into other 2 or 3 drops, forces your opponent to get zoned out. And if you use this to permanently, again, this buff is permanent. If you use this to permanently buff one of your units, especially something really sticky like a Young Silithar, you just get so much pressure on the opponent. And I think that this is a great early craft to fill out any budget line art lists. Make sure to pick up your 3rd copy of Veteran Silithar. This is one of the strongest 4-drops in the game. A 4 mana 4/5 with Rebirth means that your opponent has to deal with the egg, and they have to use a specific removal spell on this, or else it gets too much value, right? And if you can just play Veteran Silithar, force your opponent to use their whole turn dealing with it, then you just play another Veteran Silithar, and you just keep your opponent under that constant pressure. You're just going to kind of win the game by default. This is one of my favorite cards in Magmar. Pick up your third copy of Eggmorph. This is similar to Entropic Decay, where it's just a good 4-mana answer to a big threat your opponent has played. You have to make sure you have an additional way to break the egg. If your opponent plays that unit in the back line, this is where cards like Blood Tier Alchemist become very, very important to combine with Eggmorph to guarantee that you can clear that unit. The only other card that you absolutely need to get in Magmar is Mechantor Warbeast. It's epic rarity, but it's a broken 3 of auto include. Every single Magmar deck for all of time will run 3 copies of this card. It's almost never a bad play on 6. The trick with Mechantor Warbeast is that your opponent has to minimize its impact, right? But they only minimize it. It's always going to have some impact. There's tons of games that are decided by you just playing Mechantor Warbeast on 6, on turn 7, then on turn 8. Your opponent consistently can't keep a board, and then they take 12 damage to the face. And this is just a fantastic get-out-of-jail-free card. Moving on to Vanar. One of the things I like about Vanar the most is simply that they have a lot of good cards, just pound for pound, and they're also very cheap. This is one of the factions that's the easiest to get up off of the ground because you get so many of their good staple cards in the starter deck, right? Craft your third copy of Hailstone Prison. It's just a common rarity. 2 mana, answers so many different threats in this game, especially with 2 draw. In the mid-late game, your opponent's hand is going to be full most of the time, and so Hailstone Prison is essentially 2 mana hard removal. If your opponent's hand is full, when you bounce something back to their hand, the unit just goes away into oblivion. So get your third Hailstone Prison, craft 3 Fenrir War Master immediately. It's a common rarity, so this is super easy to get, day 1, and pound for pound, the amount of value that this card threatens is just absurd. Get 3 of these right away, and you won't regret it. Vanar, because a lot of their faction identity is based around just having good utility, they synergize really well with cards that are just solid and strong. So you get to use the neutral all-stars with the all-stars of Vanar, and then you have just one of the most solid mid-range decks on a budget in the entire game. The final card from Vanar that I want to point out that you should craft immediately is Razorback. 3 copies of this. This card is broken. It's obscene. If you have 2 units in play, you just slam this down on turn 4 on 4 mana. You're ready to go. The buff is permanent, so it's so difficult for your opponent to answer your board efficiently without taking even more damage. Your opponent has to scramble to keep your board clear because of the omnipresent threat of Razorback, especially in the late game. Eventually, you'll have some units stick to the board, and because Duelyst is such an aggressive, tempo-oriented game at its core, your opponent is naturally going to be sacrificing a lot of their general's HP just by trading into units and taking incidental damage here and there. And by the time you hit, 8 mana, you have the threat of double Razorback or playing a few units plus Razorback to just end the game. You're going to see this card, in a defeat screen. You're going to see Razorback and then a defeat screen when you're playing against Razorback a lot of the time. You'll be surprised at the amount of damage that this can threaten. And it's just, again, it's a busted card. Get this immediately. 3 copies. You won't regret it. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all of the cards that you should focus on getting quickly and immediately. And you've got to use your own judgment, based on what factions you want to play. Again, I want to emphasize that you should start with the neutral cards because they give you a foundation that you can branch into any faction to get strong decks and, complete your daily quests. Don't forget to use this guide in tandem with the Disenchanting guide so you know what epics and legendaries you can safely disenchant to get the spirit you need to pick up these powerful cards for the decks that you really want.